before we start, I'd just like to say I'm privileged today to be standing on the ancestral lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge First Australians as the traditional custodians of the continent, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. I pay respects to the elders of their community and extend my recognition to their descendants who are present, and I look forward to contributing to future steps towards reconciliation with First Australians. On behalf of Fellowship Numbers and Third Space, welcome to our fourth and final event of the year. My name is Roop. I work at Finity, and I'm an actuary there, so nice to meet all of you. I'm hoping you're all excited for the session as I am. If you've been invited here by a friend or a colleague, or you're just rocking up because your principal is presenting, then welcome. Fellowship Beyond Numbers is a network of people working broadly in the numbers area. So that's actuaries, people in super, even accountants. I hope I'm not roasting any accountants here. We're a network of people, and we're happy to engage with people of all backgrounds, all faith positions, as long as you want to think about life beyond just the numbers. So along with our quarterly events, we meet regularly in small groups to support one another. And later on in our program, I will talk about some of these small groups and ways you can get involved. But before we get started with the interview, just a reminder, so Steph will be presenting. If you can keep your questions to the end, because there will be allocated time to doing Q&A, that'd be appreciated. But just keep note of them, because I'm sure everyone will have questions, so that's great. So without further ado, I'll introduce Steph, or Stephen, but everyone calls you Steph. So Steph is a principal at Finity based in Sydney. He has over 13 years experience in general insurance, specializing in personal lines and commercial lines pricing, particularly in the area of natural perils and climate risk. He leads Finity's natural perils practice and has been responsible for leading the development of the Fin Perils modelling suite. Specific to perils and climate, he advises companies on how to understand the impact of long-term weather systems and climate change and what they can do about it. He believes his Christian faith helps deepen his understanding of the world amidst the evolving nature of climate change. I've pretty much worked for Steph my whole career, so I guess he's also my best friend.
Thanks, sorry.
And I think, just before you start on your presentation, it would be great to get to know a bit about you. So I have a couple of quick questions. What job would you do for free if you had the skills?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did think about it initially. And initially I would have said something to do with animals or pets or whatever, because I like animals. But then I thought something pretty good this morning. And I reckon I would be reviewing the top sushi restaurants in Japan. And one, because then I get to eat for free.
Yep.
So I can still do this without needing to have another job.
Yep.
And the second one would be I'd be able to get into all those restaurants that you normally can't book, because they're usually reserved. So I think there's double advantages there.
That sounds like a good plan. I think it's not too late to undertake that.
Okay. Time to luck.
And then one more question. We're coming up to Christmas. What's your favorite thing to do during Christmas?
Yeah, my ideal Christmas sort of scene or picture is that it'll be snowing outside, so it obviously can't be here. The kids will be here next to a fireplace. We'll be drinking mulled wine, me and Angela, on a couch. So it'll be very cozy in Christmas. So maybe it needs to be somewhere in, up in the northern hemisphere to do that.
Very nice.
That'll be a nice Christmas sort of.
Very nice. Okay, well, thanks for letting us get to know you a bit better. I think we can start the present.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll stand to make it a bit more easier. Thanks for that introduction and your interview. I'm going to be upfront and say that, look, climate risk is really complex. It's a really complex topic to cover. And there's so much ground to cover. We're not going to, we're not be able to spend every moment of today trying to look at every issue. And to do it properly, to do it justice, we probably need a whole Fellowship of Numbers series to cover everything, right? But there's only been 4 this year, right? So you probably need a few years to cover everything. But we don't have a whole year or a couple of years, and Martin was crazy enough to invite me to do this in 20 minutes. So I'm going to try to my best to unpack and condense as much as I can in the presentation today. Although noting that, we can't cover every aspect of it. So we might talk about it a little bit more after my presentation. And since not everyone in the audience today might know about climate risk as much as some of us do, I'm going to spend the first 10 minutes just giving a bit of a helicopter view of the science behind climate change. And then we'll spend 10 minutes talking about sort of how having that Christian perspective changes my view on certain things. Before Sarib and I will have a bit of discussion reflecting on some of those points I raised. And I will want to head it because much of climate risk is grounded in science. We're going to look at a lot of numbers and charts in the following slides. But I don't think there's an issue with that because how many people are actuaries in this room? Right, most people. So I have nothing to worry about. So are we ready? Let's go. All right, what's the deal with climate change and why should I care? Let's start off with the first core issue of climate change that drives everything, temperature rise. So the charts on the right comes from IPCC's or the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, which came out last couple of years. And what it's showing is the change in global surface temperature relative to pre-industrial period. It's showing that temperature has been rising steadily in the last 2,000 years, but it's skyrocketed in the last 100 or 50 or so years, particularly in the 50 years. And the rightmost chart shows this assumed up version of that with the temperature rise in actual temperature up in the orange bar. And the green one is actually what would have happened if there was no human activity contributing to it. So there's quite a bit of deviation between the two. And the main point of this chart is really to draw out that what's happened in the last 100 years has been unprecedented, right? It's not natural. It's not naturally occurring. It's not cyclical in nature. And the report actually concludes that it's unequivocal or indisputable that human activity has caused climate change. And primarily it's been caused by the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and the burning of fossil fuels. And this year's been no exception. It's been particularly hot. And we've saw, places like California and Greece burnt up, having wildfires and things like that. And we're likely to hit actually 1.43 degrees this year. So if we were to put a point on that chart, it will be even higher than where the black line ends. And it'll be actually near certainty, it'll be the warmest year on records. Now, the impact of climate change is not a distant thing because it's already impacting us everywhere and everyone in the world. And there's no part in the world where there's not been impacted by climate risk or climate change, in particular how its climate system has behaved. What the warming does is that it's making extreme conditions occur more likely, with more frequency, more severity, and less predictability. And to give you an idea, these are two charts from the IPCC reports. The first chart is showing the amount of extreme heat that's occurred in the world, so dividing the world into 30 equal distance regions. And it's extreme heat caused by human activity. So you can see everywhere it's red. So everywhere has been impacted by extreme heat in terms of climate change. And the bottom chart's showing extreme precipitation, so extreme rainfall. And almost a lot of places are already affected by that. And there's other evidences which I've not included here, other impacts such as droughts, marine heat waves, tropical cyclone intensities, and that's already been impacted. It's going to be more severe going forward. And one of the conclusions in the IPCC reports is that some of these changes are actually irreversible for centuries to millennia, such as sea level rises and or the melting of ice sheets. But there are chances that we can slow or stop some of these changes if we limit future warming. And the amount of that change will depend on what happens to carbon emissions, which I'll cover in the next couple of slides. What are the impacts to human domain? It's actually multiple domains of human life will be impacted, and I've only covered some of them in here. Firstly, for example, in ecosystems, there'll be impacts there because the extinction of species or the threatened or a lot of species would be threatened to extinction. And ecosystem is essentially a network of different species connected together. So what's happening with climate change, we're starting cutting strings of connections between different species, which other species are codependent on it. And once you cut enough strings, then you could threaten a collapse in a particular ecosystem. And this has been caused by human activities such as land use change, overexploitation of resources, pollution, introduction of invasive species, and adding of climate change, such as extreme weather. This has accelerated or threatened species in the world. For example, we saw in the 1920 Black Summer bushfires, that impacted more than 300 threatened species and hundreds of other species that we thought previously were secure. In terms of food and water security, research has shown that there's a high confidence that climate change are already impacting things like agriculture, forestry, fisheries and agriculture. And global warming has slowed the growth of agricultural productivity and affecting crop quality and yield and harvest. Something closer to all of us, something we all love, coffee. Yeah, coffee, as an example. These plants, coffee plants, need to be grown at a certain altitude and at a certain degree of temperature. And if warming keeps occurring, what the coffee plantations need to, coffee farmers need to do is to move some of these plantations up further and further in terms of altitude. And therefore, the regions that are suitable for growing coffee is going to diminish, and the yield is going to be decreased and the quality as well. And that possibly could actually threaten some of the coffee species that we're so used to today. And maybe it's going to drive up some of the prices that in the future as well. More importantly, a lot of coffee plantations, a lot of farmers really depend on that for their livelihoods, especially in Latin America. There's about 14 million farmers who are invested in this area. So if they're threatened as well, it could be an economic impact in there as well. But drinking coffee is really a luxury if you consider those that depend on food and water every day to survive. And we're making it more difficult for vulnerable people to get sources from this. Weather systems is another aspect, and climate system is really intricate that we have today. If you vary one input, that could drastically change the behavior of the whole entire system. And warming temperatures, even though it's a couple of degrees, have multiple impacts on natural perils, an area that I focus on a lot. Things like increased frequency and of extreme precipitation that could lead to flooding, high confidence that there are bushfire conditions that could be more extreme because of droughts and extreme heat. You've got cyclones and hurricanes that are moving towards the poles. So areas like Brisbane could potentially get impacted by cyclones. And sea level rises could mean some of the Pacific nations, for example, are going to be threatened in terms of where they could live. And lastly, for health, the WHO actually put health as put climate change as one of the biggest threats to health in the 21st century. And that could be impacting people in a number of ways, particularly with illnesses, heat stress in particular, and disruption to food systems, and increased exposure to diseases. Importantly, what I'm highlighting here is that climate change is not just a physical problem that we're having in the world, but it's actually a social inequality problem. And it's affecting more vulnerable people. They're the ones who are more affected. So what climate change is doing is actually stretching the spectrum of inequality even further as we go on. In terms of insurance, I think as actuaries we're all interested in this area. I've taken extracts from some of my colleagues, Khalees and Sarup, who are in the audience today, who authored this paper about the impacts of insurance affordability. Well, what happens now and into the future? At the moment, there is about 12% of households that are currently experiencing home insurance affordability. And climate change is going to further decrease affordability in the future because of these extreme events that we will undergo. And these are also correlated with areas that are with obviously a lower income and more vulnerable in terms of the population. So what's the world doing and how are they responding? It's interesting to see that almost all countries currently are still doing not still doing enough to decarbonize. I think I say almost because it's only one country, I think, Bhutan, who has negative net zero emissions, but everyone has positive and are not decarbonizing fast enough. In 2015, there was a Paris Agreement that all countries agreed to, or most countries actually, I should correct, to hold global mean temperatures to well below 2 degrees, or try to limit to 1.5 degrees. But at the same time, if we look back what's happened more recently, there are countries up there that are decreasing in terms of the rate of using fossil fuels. The clean power or renewable energy sources are up in the sort of those yellow bars there. So there are countries decreasing the use of that, but not fast enough. But at the same time, there are countries at the bottom, and a lot of them are growing rapidly in terms of use of fossil fuels and oil. And what does it mean is that as we contribute more of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that will certainly lead to warming that will continue to rise in the future. And even for Australia, current government policies are not adequate enough. We're still aiming for less than 3 degrees future by 2100. And what happens to the climate in the future depends on how we react today. Scientists have developed 5 broad scenarios in terms of warming that could happen all the way up to 2100 in terms of carbon emissions. And they take into account things like land use, the amount of air pollutants that we would emit, but it's all dependent on geopolitical risk. And actually, the number one risk to climate change is not about the technology that we're going to use to get cleaner emissions or decarbonize. It's actually about political risk. That's the biggest threat to our future. It's about the political powers making decisions and setting policies of what they want to do in terms of the industry's emissions and targets. And unless we immediately have rapid lowering of emissions, rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting to 1.5 degrees is going to be fairly impossible at this stage, or even lower than that. In fact, all scenarios, it's fairly definite that we will reach 1.5 degrees by 2030. But I do want to highlight that climate change is a threat. While it's a threat, there are also opportunities. And there's opportunities. It's not just all downside, there's upsides as well. There's 2 types of responses that we can make today to tackle climate risk. One is mitigations. These are actions that reduce or help reduce emissions, or adaptation, actions that can manage the risk of climate change impacts. For example, we're making advances into using more cleaner energy, more renewable energy that are more efficient and less polluting. We're more aware of impacts of natural disasters. So we're building more resilient communities, or trying to. There are investments and innovations in technology that could make our lifestyles more sustainable, more eco-friendly. But to do all this, we really need to cooperate between everyone in different countries. We can't just have one country do one thing and the rest of the world not following as well. So there is that gap at the moment. So that's a lot of information to cover in 10 minutes. And I just want to summarize here in really 4 points about what we just sort of covered. We know that it's likely to warm by 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages in 2030. And the current state of the world, we really can't go back to what it was 300 years ago, or even 200 years ago. We really need to drastically reduce carbon emissions in order to reach net zero. Otherwise, there's going to be severe consequences in terms of catastrophes and impacts to human livelihoods. And these climate change impacts, as I've shown, are really skewed towards people that are vulnerable, the most needy, and people who are depending on survival in the most desperate parts of the world. And climate change has given us opportunities really to do things differently through adaptation and mitigation. There's still a chance that we can limit some of these changes in the future. So I've done much reflections, as a Christian, what climate change means to me, and I feel like in order to do that and take you guys through those, we need to look at what the Bible says about the world from the beginning, and also says, look at the Bible, what it says at the end, or what it claims would happen. As a Christian, I believe the world didn't come into existence on its own, with no purpose, but rather it was carefully designed and curated by God, with human beings as a focus of his creation. And the first sentence in the Bible, if you open it up in Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's describing a creation where God has been transforming a dark, empty world, and maybe like a chaotic world, and putting structures in place. Every day he's sort of putting different creation and even animals, plants, in a very structured order. And there's design in that. And in a statement throughout chapter 1, it says that God's looking back, a bit of a review of his creation, and he's saying that it's good. 7 times he says that. And good in the original language of the Bible, which is Hebrew, means beautiful. Reminds me of the time when I went to Iceland on my honeymoon, and you go to areas of the world that you're just astounded by the beauty of the creation that we are today. A waterfalls that's like 10 stories high, and then you drive 30 minutes next, and it's volcanic rocks, and drive another 30 minutes next, and there's a sandstorm, so gale force winds. You're sort of in the midst of nature, but it's really you step back and goes, the world is really a beautiful place, but there's probably not a lot of them left, and it's hard to sort of discover places like these in our world sometimes. But the Genesis account is really trying to convey creation as something that's meaningful with purpose, and it's connected together in majestic beauty, in a way that's all held together. And in Genesis also, it's God doesn't just make this world static. He's involving us and commanding us to be involved in creation as stewards of creation. He's commanding us to work on earth, to populate it, to maintain it so it can keep flourishing. So at the end of chapter 1 in Genesis, it says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven, over every living thing that moves on earth." So it's saying that we've got a role to play here, and it's our responsibility to uphold the value, the original value and beauty that God's instilled in creation. But as we all know in the Bible narrative, that it's sin and disobedience has led to the downfall of Adam and Eve, and therefore it's perpetuated all throughout humanity. And it's a problem that's affecting the whole of human domain. It's since the failure of us to honor God and obey Him in the way that He intended us to. And I'm just not talking about human relationships or the way we relate to God. It's about everything that we've touched. It's tainted God's creation. And as I said before, it's hard for us to look back at the world and call it good today. It's not just a natural habitat, ecosystems or the pollution that sort of we've looked at, but also the way that humans are relating with one another. And I reckon climate change is an evidence of the way that we've mismanaged the world and catastrophically failed in our roles to be stewards, what God intended us to do. And the problem is clear when we saw in the previous section how uncommitted we are, how disagreeing we are and distrusting of we are between different countries of how we're trying to fix the problem and solve it. So we're now facing the situation where the world is sort of in a slow self-destructing mode. It's in a sort of like an anti-reverse creation way. Instead of species being created and flourishing, we're sort of killing them off. We're making them extinct. Instead of putting structure in the world, we're making the world a more chaotic place. We're making it more unpredictable and more unlivable. We're sort of reversing what God's done. But there is hope. And the Christian hope is about renewal. See, God's not just concerned about reversing the effects of sin that was introduced in Genesis, but He's reversing the sins in us through Jesus Christ, but also reversing the sin that's perpetuated in creation itself. So in Romans chapter 8, verse 20, The passage before that talks about having looking at its present suffering and pointing to a future hope that will be revealed. But in in verse 20, it says something specific about creation and the world that we live in today. It says, "For the creation was subjected to fertility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption, obtain freedom of the glory of the children of God." So basically what it's saying is that creation just like us has been affected by sin. It's subjected to decay like us, but it's waiting to be renewed just like us if you place your faith in God. So I believe God hasn't abandoned earth in a state that it is now, but there is hope in the last day that it will be renewed again to its state of being good in a new creation, a place where God's describing that he can dwell with us again. So I just want to conclude this presentation with 3 statements that I myself sort of put out there as sort of what I believe. And I want to just ask yourself whether you agree with some of these views. So the first one is I believe God has created a world with purpose and value. I believe that in the face of climate change, we have a role to play to preserve the beauty that God has created as well. And it's encompassing all things, people, animals, nature. And as a Christian, I do have a hope that God hasn't given up on the world at its current state. And we're looking forward to a state that it's going to be renewed, even though the situation looks pretty bleak. So I hope you enjoyed this session. Hopefully you've learned something from it and gained a bit of understanding. And just helps you think about what does creation mean to you. Thanks.